the early Caribbean digital archive. So without further ado, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you all for coming. Today I want to give an account of the lifespan of a digital project that is still in its infancy at about 3.5 years old, the Early Caribbean Digital Archive. And sort of some of what I want to walk through today, giving kind of the history of what the project is, talking about digitization and text markup, and the development of something that we're calling the co+lab, and what we're doing now. And I'll try to sort of impart some of the lessons that I've learned in trying to build a project and often kind of breaking things in order to build it along the way. So one of the toughest lessons that I had to learn when I first was the project manager on the ECDA is that it's impossible to think about or discuss or manage a digital project in any kind of linear way. And I was reminded of this every time I would assess the current standing of the project or hire on new students to work on it or to work on grants or to troubleshoot sort of daily tasks and workflows, or especially at talks like this when it's sort of the question of both what is the ECDA and what do you do on the ECDA. So the best visual that I've been able to come up with in my mind is this, and I could probably add more like tentacles or toes if I really wanted to accurately describe all of the moving parts. So some of my colleagues in the digital humanities might think in terms of structural data models, but I prefer to think in terms of sea monsters, maybe as the 19th century Americanist in me. So you can see kind of all these moving parts of any kind of digital project, and for us we have things like text encoding, site development, documentation, partnerships, acquisitions. Actually, get money to do this work, thinking about the pedagogy of it. But before I get sort of too deep in the weeds, and I'm not going to go through all of these, I want to talk about sort of what the project is and how we even got to this point. So as a 19th century Americanist who writes about and studies literature and foodways in the Atlantic, I was very excited 3-ish years ago when I was first asked to help develop a digital archive of early Caribbean materials. And at its earliest iteration, the ECDA was imagined as a digital archive of pre-20th century colonial Caribbean writings and texts. And the need for such an archive was conceived by 2 English faculty members at Northeastern in Boston, Elizabeth Maddock-Dillon and Nicole N. Aljo. And they identified a gap in digitized archival materials of the colonial Caribbean. And this came during a symposium of the Early Caribbean Society in the fall of 2011. And one of the important issues that came out of this meeting of scholars working in the early Caribbean were problems of accessibility to the texts of this era. And the continued absence of a robust digital archive has largely been the result of empire and colonialism in the Caribbean region, where negative long-standing impacts of imperialist and colonial practices is still visible in the fragmentation and the division of Caribbean print materials. Documentary materials, particularly about the colonial Caribbean, are often scattered across archives and collections in various former colonial metropoles in Great Britain, France, Germany, Denmark, Spain, etc. And in addition, although many of the contemporary archives in Caribbean countries might be accessible, some are not, and other documents remain in private hands or behind paywalls and scattered across the globe. And moreover, with a few exceptions, the history of the colonizer is the story that scholars have often found in pre-19th and 20th century Caribbean texts. So stories of European plantation owners, for instance, rather than the voices and literary histories of the Caribbean written or related by Black enslaved Creole and or colonized people. Writings from the Caribbean offer critical perspectives of the broader movements of history and culture in the early Atlantic world, and there's a wide range of scholars already engaged in generative, collaborative scholarly work in the interdisciplinary field of Caribbean studies. So the need for the archive was there, and the archive immediately began to take shape with the following objectives. First was to gather and make accessible a wide range of documents for open use and scholarship, and questions like, how do we acquire them? Like, where are these texts coming from? Who owns them? How do we figure out sort of copyright? Then, where do we store them? What platform do we use? Why are we just creating another repository, another kind of North American repository? What are we considering as our kind of primary asset in this repository? Is it PDFs? Is it transcriptions? Is it images? So the second goal was to then highlight the voices of the colonized rather than privilege the voices of the colonizers. And questions, what in practice does this look like? One of our early interventions of this was to use the text encoding initiative to mark up text and assign different tags that could then demonstrate sort of the embeddedness of different voices within texts. But what does this look like in practice? What does it mean to remix a colonial archive? And then the third goal was to do all of this digitally on a startup grant with a team of 2 faculty members and 2 humanities graduate students who are all very new to this kind of work, having never done this before. So in its design, oops, I lost my place. So in its design, the ECDA, like I said, seeks to decolonize what might otherwise be a deeply colonial archive, and this comes with its own set of challenges, many of which we are still working through. For instance, partnering with Caribbean libraries and universities, finding a way to work with non-English texts, obviously, even though we're starting as a group where we're all coming at this as studying sort of the Anglophone Caribbean. Nicole Aljo has done a lot of research on slave narratives embedded within genres such as travel narratives. So our archive really hinges upon an argument, right? Like just like any other archive, it's not a neutral archive, but we're trying to make this very transparent. So it hinges upon the argument that embedded narratives might be showcased and studied to remix the colonial archive. So we imagined an interface that could foreground previously buried and embedded histories, narratives, and cultural practices of diasporic Africans and Afro-Creole enslaved people in the Caribbean, thereby creating a new body of reassembled texts and knowledges. The ECDA is intended to not only digitally preserve historical texts, but also reframe the literary and cultural history of the early Caribbean as one in which the voices that have been buried within the imperial history can now be discerned. So there's sort of a million iterations of what the site kind of used to look like, and there's only a few that we've actually preserved, and I wish that I had them all to show. But this is our very first version, which was built upon the platform called Omeka. That was originally our place to store documents, then came a place to showcase both the documents and the exhibits. It's actually still live, but not being updated. Then we had sort of our 1.1 beta version of last year, where we migrated everything over to a WordPress instance. And then now, this is what the current site looks like, but I'll show you, and I'll give you the sort of sneak peek later. And this is coming out this academic year. And we've actually decided to move our materials into Northeastern's digital repository service, which comes with its own kind of toolkit and support. But also meant that we had to kind of think a little bit differently about our own sort of metadata standards and how we're storing our texts. So the first step in this process is through digitization, and I'm gonna, if you'll indulge me as I talk about my work and my sort of love of working with the Text Encoding Initiative, the TEI. And if you're interested and want to learn more about it, you can put an asterisk next to that on the whiteboard. And you can't really see it, but you don't really need to. It's just if you've never seen, the text as XML, like there's a little bit of what it looks like. And for those of you who may be unfamiliar, the TEI is a set of scholarly encoding guidelines for machine-readable texts in the humanities and social sciences. So that is to say, it's an XML language like HTML that's used to transcribe and encode a textual object for the purposes of preservation and publishing. And the TEI guidelines offer a way to mark up a text according to both form and content. It's a formalized way to describe sort of what the text is and a little bit about what the text is doing. So the sort of angle brackets capture not only the words on the page, but can also describe page layout and text structure, orthography, capitalization, abbreviation, variant letter forms, scribal errors, people's names and any variation, place names, and so on. Early on, we were really interested in using the TEI to construct a personography, or a list of people and their related information, so we can assign a unique individual ID to a person's name, and in our sort of larger personography, add identifying information about that person, and then that person becomes searchable from across a corpus of text. So tracking the appearances of various names across our text can be used not only to sort of amass a gigantic cast of characters, but also to view relationships and various kinship systems existent across the colonial Caribbean. I mean, we're also sort of still in development of thinking about ways we might do that for looking at place names or things that are really interesting about the Caribbean at this time, such as mentions of commodities and how commodities sort of move through the Atlantic space. So in our personography, we've added information about a person's year of birth and death, place of residence, whether they went by any other names, their occupation, their relationship to another person, and so on. And the TEI guidelines are rigorous and exhaustive. It's impossible to kind of mark up everything that they offer in a document. And even the transcription process with minimal markup takes quite a bit of time, which is one of the sort of the breaking that in my title. I think the TEI, we've done a lot of work in thinking about what that might look like, but even now sort of in terms of priorities and labor, that's something that's kind of being shelved, at least for this semester, while we work on other aspects of the project. And the TEI immediately began to get complicated. For instance, in a 1752 text called The Art of Sugar, which is a history of sugar cane production and a manual about its planting and harvesting, it describes several places across the Caribbean, Europe, and the Americas, as well as European and American colonies. This was one of the test cases for our markup procedures, one of the very first ones. And I thought about what kind of information I wanted to record about each place mentioned, such as latitude and longitude, for mapping purposes, what type of place it was, the country, what are the variant spellings. But I also wanted a way to indicate not just that a certain island was part of a colony, but which empire it was part of. And I figured out a way to do this according to the guidelines of the TEI, but then it got more complicated because many of the islands mentioned were being fought over between French and British empires at almost the exact same time that the text was written. So we needed to decide on a hierarchy or authority list that would most accurately describe these place names at particular moments of time. So it's sort of this slippery process. And in marking people, we came across different challenges in trying to do a couple things. And one was to mark sort of anonymous, unnamed people in the text, and how to do that and what that would look like across a larger personography. And then also to mark identity categories that might be useful for future researchers and scholars who might want this information. So, for instance, if a person is described in a Caribbean text with a term like samba or octoroon, how do we capture that with the TEI as a racial group, as a cultural group? What if it's a term that's often assigned to them rather than one that they within the text are self-identifying with? Is bukra a Jamaican term for a white person, most often a slave owner? Does this become a racial category? And then the term Creole is one that is particularly slippery, as it might denote race, culture, color, ethnicity, and or language. So what definition of Creole are we applying to a person being described? And how do we do so in a way that we can move consistently and thoroughly through our text? So what's so fascinating to me about applying the TEI guidelines to early Caribbean texts is the constant return to the imagining and representation of the Caribbean as a geopolitical and cultural space that throughout the 18th and 19th centuries was always in flux. And around that time, I was first beginning to grapple with these questions in my TEI markup. I was also working on chapter drafts of my dissertation that sought to locate the emergence of communities and cultures of taste-making within the Atlantic. And in both my dissertation work and my TEI work, I saw in practice what I had studied in theory, that we cannot define the Caribbean as a single fixed unit. So on one hand, the TEI takes a text and breaks it up into neat little units of data that might then be extrapolated and used for various visualizations or research purposes. But on the other hand, the TEI has been, for me, a tool of discovery that prompts me to critically investigate the text, which leads to, if not a set of answers, then at least a new set of questions. So now that I've given my account of the digitization process, I want to return to a larger set of questions and concerns about digital archive building. So what are the affordances of, or limitations of building, or even from the user end of accessing an archive in a digital environment, and sort of what are the stakes? So as a project, we strongly feel that digital archives can function as more than digital repositories. And open access to these texts is, of course, not always a given, so I don't mean to downplay the significance of having available this range of scholarly texts that are free for users to either read on the screen or to download. That is hugely important work. But in thinking through the possibilities of digitizing a body of material, we got excited about the idea of creating a sort of commons environment where scholars could view the materials as networks of related texts. And we wondered what would happen if we built a space that could foster collaboration and original research that is developed on the site itself. And this is something that my co-project manager, Ben Doyle, and I came up with and decided to call the co+lab. So our original idea of the co+lab was a space for users to access materials, save them to bookshelves and collections, create topical exhibits of materials, annotate them, write and publish blog posts, access and share pedagogical materials, and find other scholars working in similar areas. And we're still interested in building this out, but lately we've been thinking about the archive as a contributory space with content, annotation, and material that is being shaped and developed by its own user community. So our project continuously and necessarily negotiates what digital archives are meant to do. Where, we asked ourselves, was the distinction between a digital repository of texts, a curated selection of digitized materials, and exhibits that gathered and presented them thematically? Like, when does a digital archive become a digital archive? Is it with 10 texts or with 100 texts? Like, does it matter which one is more representative? So how might our archive, we wondered, become something other than a repository or sort of a guide to, our own collection of Caribbean works? So we routinely return to the ideas of the commons and community as one of the driving forces and ethical imperatives of our building. So within about a year or so of trying to build this project, we realized that the mentality that we had going into it, which is like if we build it, they will come, like the users, actually that's a model that doesn't work. And this came about as sort of a result of our building and trying to balance sort of what we thought the site should be with what a user community kind of needed or thought that the site should be. And we wanted to get a better sense of who might use the platform and why, and we recognized some of the limitations of our first Omeka platform, which is one of the reasons why we made that initial switch to WordPress. But mainly we began to feel that we didn't want a static site. And the last thing that we wanted was to build a website that nobody would use. But in order to build a community, we needed to think carefully about users and their needs. And I can't overstate this enough, as this informs everything from the order of the items that we ingest to kind of the design of the website and where it's built. So for instance, at a conference in Martinique, we presented our site on the university's kind of low bandwidth internet, and we sort of watched with dismay as the page slowly loaded. Like, this machine's been slow for me today, but it sort of almost didn't work. It would just kind of stop and fail its connection. So we learned then about how we might build pages that could load faster with fewer images, or how we might instead prioritize building upon a mobile version first rather than second. And then out of that, we've spoken to and met a larger community of early Caribbeanist scholars who are interested in the intersection of the Caribbean and Atlantic world scholarship with the digital humanities. They have this interest in it, but sort of don't know where to begin. So the project is still working on the problematic of how to shape a digital archive. That's one part repository and one part sort of lab and commons. And in doing so, we're reimagining a model to the kind of traditional digital archive. And this is the coming soon. This is what's underneath that. Still very much a work in progress, even of this morning. Still, things are still being kind of reshaped and added, and there's a lot of content that still needs to go in here. But what we have in the site is kind of thinking about our 3 tiers of the project. So we have our open access, digital archive to get started from. This highlights sort of the classroom and pedagogy, including student projects that they did using Google Maps engine, which then became defunct, and we had to scramble to save their actual data, which is another time. And then here is where we're reimagining what the co+lab will be, so things like annotation, doing more with link to open data, having sort of a project studio, ability to use existing tools and technologies rather than building our own, because we're sort of we're kind of developing it from the ground up. We don't have a lot of sort of technical leads on this, so we're thinking, why not use the tools that are already exist? So something like a Google Fusion table, and providing some ready-made data sets for people who then want to do something with them. So here's sort of an early version of the things that we have in the archive, a visualization of sort of where things are published, so you can get kind of a at-a-glance sense of where things were published. Or that is their geographic spatial data. This is publication data. A visualization of the genres that we have. So we have a mostly slave narrative treatise. And just some early network data in terms of where things were published. And then using the existing tool Hypothesis to do annotation. And working with Night Labs to do some timeline and mapping. So here it's not showing up, but on sort of this axis is a list of the genres that we're working in, so that you can see sort of who wrote it, when they wrote it, what the genre is. And then this is sort of a view of the current archive page, where you can go and sort of discover the text that you're looking for or that you want to work with. So we're also invested in helping researchers approach the archive from the level of data, to engage the archive at the macro through data visualizations, and at the micro through helping us shape our metadata and cataloging standards. And as we've discovered, as we've sort of rethought our own kind of metadata standards, the concepts of author and creator do not easily map onto existing or commonplace data management logics when viewed through early Caribbean critical frameworks. For instance, and this goes back to our idea of how can we kind of remix or reimagine the archive, we need to think about what's at stake in naming a figure like Joanna from John Stedman's travel narrative. Especially who may or may have not been a fictional character of the colonial Caribbean, but whose story and voice is included within this travel narrative. What does it mean to name her as the author of what would normatively be Stedman's narrative? How can we promote the kind of linked open data not widely supported by traditionally static record interfaces but that are something of a requirement if we want to facilitate conversation among early Caribbeanists. And another example is how might we ensure a figure such as Louis Asa, who has a relatively understudied narrative that's published as an appendix to Mary Prince's narrative, which is more widely studied. So how do we ensure that his narrative is no longer subsumed by another narrative in which it is contained? And we also want to promote our users' ability to fork such data through other tools and for other contexts. So the co+lab is our initiative that will be more widely developed and released with this sort of version 2.0 this academic year. And through this co+lab, we imagine that users can use ECDA to build maps and timelines, publish their own exhibits, and engage with other co+lab users in discussions of text through our open annotation commons through Hypothesis. And lastly, the ECDA has an investment in mentoring students to rethink their own role in contributing to the knowledge work of the humanities and the digital more broadly. And we're really invested in sort of bringing in undergraduate voices, publishing their work on the site, and sort of taking their research just as seriously. So to sort of sum up, for the ECDA, Reimagining the Archive begins with kind of reimagining research, or thinking critically about the type of research that is done in a digital environment, and responding critically to its given structures of knowledge creation and management. And we are invested in knowledge as a thing that's made and remade primarily and necessarily through collaboration, and for our community in particular, at the intersection of early Caribbean studies and the digital humanities. So we hope to offer our community the ability to not only enter the archive, but to respond to it as not just a matter of necessity, but of responsibility. And I think that if the digital affords us anything, it's to create new opportunities to speak back to structures of knowledge, information, and practices given to us. And in this context, the archive, the database, and the interface. And I'm interested in how reimagining digital archival research occurs both through the study of the daily practices of researchers, from the honed practices of experienced practitioners, to the experimentation and exploration of undergraduates. How do we build not just interfaces, though perhaps that's the final response, but also information architectures that intentionally expose and invite response to how they manage data, enable or cannot enable discoverability, and making a part of research a critical engagement with their limitations as a way of moving towards new structures of knowledge and access, and at the very least, a more critically informed generation of practitioners. And the end. Thank you.
Thank you.
And happy to answer any questions about what this is and what we're doing.
That was so interesting, Liz. My question has to do with how you actually represent the narrative. For example, the slave narrative. How does it look when you put it up? Do you put up a hyperlink text? Do you put up text that as it appears in a document? What do you show?
So that's something that we want to use the TEI for, because we have gone back and forth for deciding, do we want to sort of display a PDF of a manuscript or a transcription, and we like the idea of having both. So with the TEI, we can display this as kind of a plain text, like something akin to what you would see on Doc South, but we also want to have available, whatever kind of manuscript version that we have. But something cool that the TEI would allow us to do would be to kind of go through a text like Stedman's narrative, find the instances that we're identifying as an embedded or interpolated slave narrative, mark those, and kind of take them out and present them as almost like a new type of document. And it's not something that we have live yet, but that was sort of the envisioning of how it would look. So most of the text that we have up now, you'll find either or both the PDF or the transcription. And we were also really interested in not just kind of having just a standalone text, but we wanted a sort of scholarly introduction. So this is something that came out of last year, where a group of graduate students were working on kind of critical scholarly introductory headnotes that would kind of situate the user to kind of the publication and the reception history of a text. So we became, and that's one of the reasons why we have so few texts online versus we have almost 200 texts in our kind of internal pipeline, but before they get onto the site, we were thinking about, do we have a plain text transcription? Do we have a way to annotate them? Do we want to mark them up in TEI? How much detail, because that takes a long time. And do we have this sort of introductory headnote that will situate the scholar to what this is?
So interesting, thank you.
So I can see that you are really concerned about editing. In a way, that's something that you're taking from the traditional approach to text, and you are incorporating it into this new system.
Yeah.
I don't know up to what point should people just have the document without having the editing.
Exactly, yeah. And we do want to have just, available if you simply want to read John Stedman's narrative as is, it's there. You read it, download it. And then what we want to offer is sort of our kind of, our argument, our kind of critical, notes on what would it mean or what would it look like if we kind of identify this figure in this text as somebody kind of telling her own story. So we kind of are situating it as we want to do both, but we do want to be mindful of making transparent what our scholarly practices are and sort of why we're trying to do what we're doing. And I think that's something that separates it from being, a repository. I think that once you start thinking about digital archive, it can be a repository, and that's awesome. But I'm trying to think of what happens when we just make very clear sort of what our sort of non-neutral approach to reading and interpreting these texts are. Yeah.
You mentioned in the beginning that one issue with getting access to these texts is that it's not really available to the public. Like, how can you talk a little bit about your process of getting access to these texts?
Yeah, our first process when we first began was to just try to find these texts online, and we didn't make them public, but download them to our own folders and be and then we'll find out the copyright later, and that didn't get us very far. So it's really, we've been making a lot of partnerships with existing libraries, the Digital Library of the Caribbean, and they have a great sort of open access mission. So they were helping us to reach out to libraries and kind of make partnerships. And then since then, we have partnered with Lion Key, we have connections at the British Library, the John Carter Brown Library. There's a lot of libraries that have these holdings that they're either they're digitized, but they're willing to let us do something with them, or they haven't been digitized and they're willing to sort of let us come and digitize them. We've been working with Happy Trust and Internet Archive to figure out what it means to use these materials, because it's an interesting question. It's something that when we started the project, none of us really had an understanding of sort of any thorny copyright issues of texts that are early enough that they're out of copyright, but they're still kind of behind a lot of institutional archival paywalls. And at a lot of conferences, we'll have people who have materials and they want to share them with us, and then they're like, "Is that it?" And we're like, "Yes, anything." We just have access to the Thistlewood diaries, which are very, very long, and we want to do something with that. So we have a lot of materials that we haven't yet been ingested into the site, but that we have kind of access through all of our partnerships. Yeah.
Good luck with the Thistlewood diaries. That sounds like an absolute nightmare.
Yeah, it is in many ways.
So for the past 2 years, I had a student who did a project at Loyola using this archive as her portal, which was very successful. This was Johanna Dorson, who won all kinds of awards at Loyola, including the Presidential Medal, which is the highest undergraduate award for a project that derived from earlier versions of this site. That
Oh, I'm so
she
happy
worked
to
at
hear
over
that.
2 years. So I've spent a lot of time browsing it myself.
And how it changes every day.
Yes, I did notice that. But I think what was powerful about the site for her was that it simply presented a lot of texts that I had never heard of and that are not really visible. And so, I mean, you sort of downplayed the role of the site as a repository.
Yeah.
But in many ways, what I found useful about it was the fact that I had never heard of some of these texts. And there were also other travel narratives or things in there that mentioned, her project was about African spirituality, that were marked as referencing African spirituality when it otherwise wouldn't have been obvious that these narratives treated those subjects. And so this is just my user feedback.
Yeah.
I like the fact that the site had the potential to portray or simply deposit huge numbers of texts that scholars might not otherwise be aware of.
Yeah, no, I think that's so great. And something that I'm really interested in is to thinking about sort of issues of discoverability and browsing. Like there might be somebody who comes to the site because they're looking for, they know what text they're looking for, or they might just want to know, what texts are out there. But so that's one of the reasons why we sort of start piloting the introductory headnotes. If this is somebody who doesn't know anything about this text, and before they go and read it, what is it about? And we're thinking too about ways that we can better kind of display, especially sort of on the right away, like what are sort of thematic texts. Like if somebody's just interested in texts about sugar or food or obeya or anything, how can we get them right to it? And we've been trying to think about how that could come through with exhibits, like topical exhibits. So early on, we had one of that was just early Caribbean slave narratives, and one that was all about obeya, and I was developing one that was all about sort of food, so that people have multiple ways of accessing the information that they, like you said, like don't even know is in there, beyond just kind of like a list of, alphabetized list of texts. Yeah, so figuring out how people can even discover them is a big question.
So I love the story of just like the process of decolonizing knowledge that had been centralized and defined and labeled and packaged under the terms of colonialism. I'm really intrigued by a point you made about how when you were doing this TEI I know nothing about, but that it taught you different questions, new things to look at in the literature. And I'm just wondering, so there's the logics of colonialism and humanism that shaped the way these texts have been read before. What are the new logics and the new kinds of questions? What are some examples of things that you wouldn't have thought about before, and where are these things coming from? Are they coming from the technology? Are they coming from, a different way of thinking about knowledge?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it definitely, I feel like we had so many just like long, interesting meetings that when we were trying to, train people on the TEI, who might be kind of new to thinking about Caribbean literature or might, already be there. But thinking about sort of the, what does Creole mean, right? Like that's something that, you could go to any kind of Caribbean theorist and sort of get that definition. Like whose definition of Creole are we using? Like Sean Goody's definition? Like, and how does that then like map onto a wide range of texts from sort of, a large region and across, a long span of time. Like, does it change? So it really, I think, caused us all to sort of slow down a little bit and to think about what sort of the limits are and trying to kind of tag this information as data. I mean, something that we kind of suspected going in, that it's not easy to kind of categorize the text or the people in it or the movements that they make or the categorizations that they assign, that the authors of the text assign to characters. So it really just made us kind of slow our thinking process down and think about the words that are being used or the text themselves and kind of the why it matters. So then we would often grapple with, okay, like what does it mean to mark an anonymous person? What does it mean to mark an anonymous group of people? What information do we want to record about them? And we were trying to kind of forecast would future researchers like be interested in this information? And the answer was usually like, yes, somebody can make a case for yes, but then we can't mark everything, or else you'll never get through a document. So I'm not sure if I have like a conclusive answer, except that it made us kind of rethink our approaches to the technical side and our approaches to the research and thinking about what people might want to do with this information.
But does the technology create another kind of like colonial framework? And you
Yeah.
have to be stuck with that's kind of what it sounds like you're saying, but it seems to me like it should be so much more enabling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little bit of both, and there are definitely arguments that to assign these kind of labels via the technology is kind of putting different sort of people or identities in particular groups or boxes. But the TEI, it also enables you to kind of customize it and to it forces you to kind of make editorial decisions that I think at times we weren't always comfortable with, especially in thinking about like the assigned racial group. So when I went through, if we're marking instances of, Octoroon or Sambo, I think we came up with and had to like create this new TEI element. That's something that you can do, is kind of add to the guidelines that we labeled assigned racial category, and then even that we weren't quite satisfied with, but we thought of this step as a way of kind of as a test case for piloting, and then seeing the step that we haven't gotten to yet, right, is then like how do we display it, or what do we do with it, or how does it afford researchers the ability to find something that they might not otherwise have found. So yeah, still very much an important question that we're thinking about. Oh yeah, I thought you were pointing to something.
I think it's absolutely fantastic talk, Liz, and I think one of the things that really resonated for me is when you're talking about naming, and I think so much of when we think about teaching with Atlantic literatures, the fluidity of naming, right, that comes out, and in some ways it's fascinating. I think the line that I really like is how, and this goes off Suzanne's point, how you speak back to structures of knowledge that exist within these worlds. Are there places, and maybe this speaks to what you're doing with the rest of it, where TEI actually just stops you? And that TEI is the end of the conversation, but there are other parts of the repository or the archive that are where you can actually then pick up that conversation or have it instead. I'm sort of wondering where TEI isn't the be-all, end-all, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I mean, I think that's one of the reasons too why we decided sort of maybe last spring semester or thereabouts to kind of shift the primary work, or thinking about is the sort of the primary asset that we want to save in our repository, is it the XML document? And the importance of that is that an XML document is the TI, it's open source, it's sort of extensible, it's good for preservation as opposed to something like a PDF. But it was the difficulty in kind of doing the work that was really slowing us down, to be honest, with a very small team of people doing this work. 2 faculty members and a very small team of graduate students. So that is why we really started to think about how we might use existing tools that are out there, put them out right on the site for people to use, especially as we were at conferences and meeting more and more Caribbeanists, and we had a beta group that were sort of expressing the desire to like do something with these materials, like do something with digital humanities and early Caribbean materials, and not sort of knowing where to begin. So I think, the priority did kind of shift to thinking about getting those items on the site, having that repository there, ways to discover them, ways to use them immediately in the classroom. We did sort of a big push last year to like how can we develop sort of lesson plans and assignments for students to use, and we've had really good success with that. And to think about different ways of discoverability. Yeah, TI is just my personal project in it, but there are definitely sort of many other, the octopus, right, there's many other waving arms around.
I'm curious about the decision to move it onto the institutional repository at Northeastern
Yeah.
and how that went.
Yeah,
How it's
it was.
going.
It was well. So the digital repository service, they just sort of kind of created and built sort of their own toolkit for projects to use. So there were newer projects that were moving in there, and we weren't sure because it actually. We weren't sure if that would strip out a lot of the kind of existing functionality that we had, and that it might be sort of a delayed gratification kind of thing, where it's like we take a few steps back for the expectation that down the road it'll enable both, preservation and added functionality. Because we do, now that we're partnered with the library, there is sort of a little bit less of the customization than before, where we could just kind of do whatever we want with it, and now we're kind of thinking carefully about how that fits in with what the DRS is promoting through their toolkit. So it was, and it also kind of put in a new workflow of kind of amassing all of our texts and putting them in a CSV sheet and thinking really carefully about the metadata and what the library wanted and how we kind of translated that to text that we weren't really sure kind of what, who we're listing as the primary author or what edition we're privileging. So that was sort of a summer kind of project, was getting that up and running. So now it's there, and then now it's sort of pointing. We have the digital repository with with all of our texts, and then the sort of WordPress front-facing site is they're gonna be kind of connected in that way. But yeah, it wasn't an easy decision, although it was a good decision, but it was sort of ceding some of our control for the greater good of the project and its long-term use, especially if the project is managed by graduate students who then leave, and the time spent training somebody else, it makes sense to have the input and the support of the library.
Well, join me in a round of applause for this. Great start. So October 26th, Piper Hall, we'll be launching the Women in Labor, the Molly West story, a fantastic project that's created here in Loyola over the summer. Thank you all for coming today, and please let us know what you want to learn.
Yeah. Thank you.